Okay, the Bible professor here. This is part two of our tour to Israel here in 2023. On this episode, we're going to look at Caesarea and the remains there of Herod the Great's structures and other archaeological finds there. We'll come back through Mount Carmel, tell Megiddo, and Nazareth. Stick around again to the end, and I'll sort of recap some of the Bible lessons that we learned there. So here we go. Lessons from the land, Caesarea, tell Megiddo. Okay, out at Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast, Herod the Great had built up this city. Herod the Great, who is the backdrop of the gospel stories and the book of Acts. Caesarea figures prominently in the book of Acts because Philip is here. Peter goes down here to meet with Cornelius. Paul comes through here a number of times on his way to Rome and so forth. A lot of archaeological finds that relate to the Bible have been found here. The theater, a lot of that has been restored, so you can go, and we actually sat in that. And I taught scripture from the book of Acts on site there, Paul being on trial here in this town, if not in the very theater. A prison has recently been uncovered, and they were doing some conservation or preservation on that while we were there as well. The Roman aqueduct that comes down from Mount Carmel, it runs several miles. It's out there on the beach, and we actually went out to that, played in the water a little bit, took pictures, whatnot. The harbor, Herod the Great's harbor, the remains of that is here. The remains of a palace, one of his palaces, the remains, lots of other remains here. The Pilate inscription. In 1961, an Italian excavation uncovered an inscription bearing the name Pontius Pilate. So you see that here. This is the first physical evidence outside of the Bible of Pontius Pilate. The first word in the inscription, Tiberium, probably refers to a temple that was dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius at the time. By the way, Pilate's name was also recorded by a well-known Roman historian, Tacitus, who mentioned that Pilate crucified Christ, just as the gospel stories say. Tacitus wrote the following words sometime in the late 1st century. Nothing which could be done by man, nor any amount of treasure that the prince could give, nor all the sacrifices which could be presented to the gods could clear Nero from being believed to have ordered the burning, the fire of Rome. So to silence the rumor, he tortured and made false accusations against those who were called the Christians, who were hated for their large following. Christus, the founder of the name, was executed by Pontius Pilate, the Judean procurator, during the rule of Tiberius. So there's extra biblical attestation of Christ and Pontius Pilate. And so there's one among a number of reasons why you can never mind people who, get on their blog or whatever, and blog experts who say they're, Jesus was a myth, or even, guys bigger than with a bigger platform than that, like a Bill Maher. Oh, I think Jesus never existed, he said on Larry King's show one time. These guys haven't read history and probably don't care to. So anyway, be careful who you listen to out there, right? Herod Agrippa I died here in Acts 12. And here's what the scriptures say. Luke says this in Acts 12, verse 20. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out the voice of a God, not of a man. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. Josephus recorded it this way. Josephus said, a severe pain also arose in his belly, and it began in a most violent manner. He therefore looked upon his friends and said, I, whom you call a God, am commanded presently to depart this life, while providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, and immediately to be hurried away by death. But I am bound to accept of what providence allots as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. When he said this, his pain was become violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor went abroad everywhere that he would certainly die in a little time. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age, and in the 7th year of his reign, for he reigned 4 years under Caius Caesar, 3 of them over Philip's tetrarchy only, and on the 4th he had that of Herod added to it. And he reigned besides those 3 years under the reign of Claudius Caesar, in which time he reigned over the forementioned countries, and also had Judea added to them, as also Samaria and Caesarea. Josephus' Antiquity. Okay, so again, the prison has been located here. Herod's the foundations of Herod's palace, his harbor, where he engineered cement, and they sunk stones and cement out into the ocean and made built a water break, a harbor for the ships to come in safely from the waves and so forth. So Herod the Great's harbor was one of the great engineering feats, which he had several of those because he was a master builder, actually. The hippodrome has been found here, the theater, and as I said, a lot of archaeology going on here. Let's consider the scriptural relevance of Caesarea. Acts 8, verse 40, Philip found himself at Azotus, and he passed through, he kept preaching the gospel to all the cities until he came to Caesarea. Acts 9:30, when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. Acts 10 is the story of the Apostle Peter and Cornelius. Acts 12, Herod Agrippa I is here. He dies. Acts 18:22, when he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. Acts 21, it's another long passage there, starting in verse 8. Paul's journey to Jerusalem, and Caesarea is mentioned here. Acts 21, Caesarea. The plot against Paul's life and his transfer to Caesarea. That goes on here. Acts 24, this chapter focuses on Paul's trial before Felix in Caesarea. So let's look at that for just a moment. So really you have Acts 8, Acts 10, Acts 12, and then Acts 21, pretty much in every chapter. Maybe not, maybe one of them, Caesarea is not mentioned, but you have Caesarea playing prominently in the book of Acts. So in Acts 24, Paul is in prison. In Acts 24, this attorney comes down for the Jews, and they're laying out this charge against Paul. And the governor nodded for Paul to speak. Acts 24:10, Paul responded, I'm going to make my defense to you. He talks about the way the Christian sect, the sectarian group, as the Jews saw it, and Rome saw it. And Paul's talking about, the hope of the resurrection, which he always does. And Felix, verse 22, having a more exact knowledge about the way, said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. He gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom. Some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And then Festus shows up. He went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and they brought charges against Paul. And Caesarea is mentioned again in verse 6. And then Paul has to appear before King Agrippa. This is Agrippa II, the grandson or great-grandson of Herod the Great. And he is here at Caesarea as well. Chapter 26, Paul is before Agrippa II. Chapter 27. So Caesarea is mentioned multiple times in the book of Acts. Okay, heading back toward the Galilee region, we stop off at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is, of course, where the showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah And Elijah says, let's have a contest. The real God who answers with fire from heaven, he's the God we're going to worship. Okay. They said, okay, sounds good. And, they take the better part of the day to cry out to their gods and make sacrifices, and no answer out of the skies. Elijah calls to Jehovah God. He sends fire out of heaven to consume the altar. So to consume, the altar and the offering and everything. So Elijah has the prophets of Baal killed. The people kill them, and they turn back to worshiping the true God. 1 Kings 18:19. Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. 1 Kings 18, it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth. So this is 1 Kings 18 where all this goes down. 2 Kings chapter 1, now Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab, and Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber, which was in Samaria, and became ill. So he sent messengers and said to them, go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I will recover from this sickness. This is that time where the king sends these captains of 50s, groups of 50s up to get Elijah. And again, he calls fire down out of heaven. 2 Kings 2, he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. 2 Kings 4:25, so she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi, his servant, behold, there's the Shunammite. This is the woman who Elijah had helped, and now he's got to raise her son from the dead. And Isaiah 35. So Mount Carmel is mentioned several times in the Old Testament, not just with Elijah, but it certainly is there. Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the desert will be glad, and the Arabah will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and shout of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious heart, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. So there's a word of encouragement to Zion there, Isaiah 35, but does mention the majesty of Mount Carmel. And you go on top of the mountain today. We go on top of the church there, and it's a beautiful little area up there, but we go on top of the church building. They allow you to go up there and you look down over the plain of Jezreel, or the Jezreel Valley, or Armageddon, Harmegiddo is the hill of Megiddo, which we'll see in a moment. But this is the valley here, the valley of Armageddon, and you can look out over the valley there. It's a really great overlook, and just to imagine not only the battles that have already been fought there over the millennia, but also the great battle that will come, which will come to a head here on this plain. Now, the plain's really huge. It goes all the way on down a long, long way. But probably right here in this region is where it will come to a head. Tell Megiddo. When we go to Megiddo, it is a huge archaeological tale. There are, by different counts, 26, 27 or so layers and levels of civilization. And so archaeologists, they dig a shaft down and they see the layers of civilization there that they date by pottery and other things. But anyway, Megiddo has what's popular with archaeologists, a double gate system. It was a fortified city. It was one of Solomon's fortified cities. Has a double gate system there. Horse stables. Solomon had horse stables here. There is this, I think it's 25 feet in diameter. There's a huge Canaanite altar that was here, and they've restored it. There's a huge cistern here. You go down under the ground. I don't know how far. It was a long way, a couple hundred feet maybe, a long way down under the ground, and you go out the tunnel and come out of the park or the ruins that way when you exit. But there's lots of things on top to look at. The Canaanite altar the remains of the palaces of the Israelite kings. There's a manger here. Again, there were horse stables here. This is a feeding trough for the horses. These types of stone mangers are found all over the land of Israel. Most people think in Christmas of the manger Jesus was laid in, being one made out of wood with the straw in it. But it could very well have been he was laid in a stone manger. Again, lots of stone mangers are found, these feeding troughs. And I think that's actually quite fitting, because to come into his earthly life and incarnation and be laid in a stone bed, and then Joseph Arimathea at the end of his earthly life, incarnated life, he's laid in a stone bed as well, right? And plus, in the middle of those two points on either end of his earthly spectrum, he is the rock, right? The rock of our salvation. He is the stone cut out without hands. Anyways, just a thought. Again, the Valley of Jezreel, as you can see out beside here, okay? Megiddo, the city stands at the southwest edge of the plain of Esdraelon on the main route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. It overlooks the historic route where a pass through the Mount Carmel range led from the plain of Sharon into the plain of Jezreel. This strategic position made Megiddo one of the most important commercial and military centers of Palestine in the second millennium BC and in the early first millennium BC. From earliest times, the environs have been the scene of major battles. Great military men such as Tutmosis III of 15th century BC Egypt, Napoleon in 1799, and General Allenby during World War I have fought for mastery here, and lots of others. And that's out of the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. Some biblical references also. Well, at the time of the conquest, Joshua defeated the king of Megiddo, but did not take the city. Joshua 12. When the tribes were allotted their lands, Megiddo was assigned to Manasseh, but they could not conquer it from the Canaanites. That's Joshua 17 and Judges chapter 1. During the time of the judges, Deborah and Barak defeated the forces of Hatzor under the command of Sisera by the waters of Megiddo. Judges 4 and 5. At any rate, by the time of Solomon, Megiddo served as headquarters of one of his 12 administrative regions, 1 Kings 4, and it was one of his chariot cities, 1 Kings 9, 15 and following. King Ahaziah of Judah died here, 841 BC, after he was wounded by Jehu, 2 Kings 9. King Josiah of Judah had met and intercepted Pharaoh Necho of Egypt here at Megiddo in a vain effort to prevent him from going north to aid the Assyrians. And Josiah was fatally wounded here. The plain of Megiddo, as I said, is referred to in Zechariah's prophecies of restoration for Israel and Jerusalem, Zechariah 12. And Revelation predicts the great future battle here that will take place called Armageddon, the Mount of Megiddo, Revelation 16:16. So what else to say? Tel Megiddo is a great place to go to see varied archaeological ruins from various time frames, all the way back from various time periods, all the way back to Canaanite period through the time of Solomon to the kings of Israel and their battles later, a couple centuries later, and then again into even modern history. Battles have been fought there. Okay, what about Nazareth? We know it as the boyhood home of Jesus. It was the home of Joseph, who was a descendant of David. Not a lot of archaeology has been uncovered there, and a lot of that has to do, well, for two reasons. Number one, it was a very tiny, poor community in the first century. And number two, the modern city has been built over it, before a lot of the excavations could be done. But I have put in the link below a link to an essay by a British-Israeli archaeologist, Mrs. Yardena Alexander, that she shared on the Times of Israel podcast, and discussing some of the salvage digs she's done there and other places in Israel. but she discusses what they have found. And a lot of what they found is very near or some underneath the Church of the Annunciation that you can visit there in Nazareth today. Interestingly as well, some radical folks have posted out there, Nazareth never existed and things like that, and therefore Jesus never existed. These things were made up in the minds of early Christians. This is so ahistorical, unreasonable, irrational. It is so dismissive of actual archaeologists and actual historians and actual scholars. So anyway, but she does mention on here what has been found there that dates to the 1st century clearly. And as a matter of fact, even on Bart Ehrman, as skeptical as he is, on his website, you can see where he's actually written against some of those radicals who say Nazareth never existed, how that they are actually say things that fly in the face of anybody who's actually been on a dig there or participated or actually researched it out. So anyway, you can go to Nazareth. It's there. Anyway, Nazareth, again, remember that map on my last, on part 1, where you can hike, right? Cana, Nazareth, Sepphoris, and right on down to Magdala and to Capernaum, and hike through this region. It's all on the same ancient route. But this was a small community, a very small town. In John 1, remember the attitude of one of the disciples who's being called to Jesus. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Right? But again, this was showing either ignorance of or forgetfulness of Isaiah's prophecy, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, right? That was a reference, a prophecy of the Messiah in the region he would be in. So it also shows the prejudices of the people against the smaller towns and so forth, at least Nazareth at the time, John chapter 1 and Isaiah 9. These are 2 passages I'm mentioning. But here, this precipice you go out on that we're standing here on, and I'm pointing at something there. I don't remember what, probably the valley that you can see below. But in Luke, famous passage here where Jesus is quoting from Isaiah. He's actually gone into the synagogue. He entered the synagogue. And matter of fact, Luke 4:16. He came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read, and the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And he opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And then he said to them, he said a few other things, like a prophet is, no prophet is welcome in his own hometown. And here's the thing. He read their prophet to them. He said, "This is fulfilled in your hearing today." I guess they didn't quite get it yet, that he's saying this is fulfilled in me, right? But then when he brings up, again, their very own Hebrew Bible, the issue of the widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, verse 25, and the famine. But Elijah, their greatest prophet, was sent to none but to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, right? That's in the land of the Goyim, the Gentiles. And also in the time of Elisha with the lepers, and none of them was cleansed but Naaman the Syrian. So he's showing that God's favor, God's grace, God's blessing was actually also extended to the non-Jew, which the prophets had said it would be, Isaiah especially. Verse 28, and all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things, and they got up and drove him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went his way. How did he escape? Miraculously. Why did he escape? Because, as he said several times in the Gospel of John, his hour had not yet come. It was not time in the eternal counsels of God, of the triune Godhead, in the providence of God. It was not time for Jesus to be killed yet, so he wasn't going to be crowned king yet either, as some people tried to do here and there, because that would have brought about a premature death by the Romans. So it was all in God's hands, all in God's providence. And our lives as well, men and women, are in God's hands and in his timing. And I think that we should take great comfort in that fact, actually. And so I think that's a great lesson for us here. Additionally, Sepphoris has been a much larger town nearby, a few miles away, has been excavated, and some have said Richard Beatty, especially in his book, Jesus and the Forgotten City, have demonstrated that probably, Jesus and Joseph traveled there for work, as an artificer, as a multi-tradesman, a man who could work with wood, lumber, and stone. And so anyway, this is the region Jesus grew up in here, seeing these very hills, bodies of water, these very sites, walking on these very paths that you can walk on there. So just a few summary lessons. Caesarea is found on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Ocean. It figures prominently in the life of Herod the Great, in the life of the evangelist Philip, Peter as he comes to evangelize the Jews. So that's Acts 8, Acts 10, and then 21 and following. Well, Acts 12, Herod Agrippa the First is here. Acts 21 and following, the Apostle Paul is here. And a lot of the first century stuff has been uncovered here. Some of the finds here date from later centuries, but the theater, the palace, the prison, most of the bigger things are going to date to the first century Herod the Great had built. And so the Apostle Paul was here. Philip was here, lived here, actually. You find him living here at the end of later on. Peter was here. From Mount Carmel, we learn about faithfulness to God. Elijah was faithful, and just a few people were during that time. And faithfulness to God pays off, right? And from Tel Megiddo, we learn of all the kings there, so many of them who followed the sins of those who had gone before them. They didn't seek the Lord with all their heart. They didn't put away the idols and things like that. And they didn't trust God, seek God's face for certain decisions they made with the kingdom. Again, we notice that we learn from archaeology and history and the biblical text that Solomon, the wise king, the really wise king, he was problematic and not perfect, but he was a really wise king nonetheless. He had his chariot city here. So him and a lot of the other kings of Israel, the biblical kings, had been here and come through here. So it's a great point of history and an anchor point in world history to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament text. And then in Nazareth, we learn of those who were, again, not true believers in Christ when he said things, and when he said things that they were okay with, then they're okay with that. If it doesn't pierce them and affect, if it doesn't show relevance and application to them or against them, or touch right where they live, where the rub is in their life, right? Things they need to get right with God, then it's fine as long as it doesn't apply to them. And that's much like it is today. Incidentally, a lot of Christians and people in the churches, as long as a soft, fluffy, feel-good, motivational speech is given to them, they're all good. Life is hunky-dory. They think everything's good. But as soon as something convicting or, a truth of Scripture is brought to bear against their sins or whatever issues in their life, then they're not so happy with the messenger. And that's how it was with Jesus. They tried to push him off this cliff here in Nazareth. But it wasn't God's timing. And that's, again, another lesson, is to be encouraged about God's timing in our lives. Okay. Next episode, episode 3, we're going to head down to Jerusalem. We'll actually end up there in the episode, but we check out Jericho, Beit Shan, and the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. So hopefully you'll check us out, episode 3, part 3 of Israel. I'm the Bible professor. Bye.